Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Zoom session, which is about the statement by the Minister of Labour, Department of Employment and Labour, that they intend to audit every recipient of Ters since April of this year, 2020. I think, by the way, it's a ridiculous statement because they weren't able to manage the rollout of Ters at all effectively. And as we know, they've massively messed it up. But now they intend to audit every single employer who has received Ters because the Auditor General have said to them, you guys have stuffed up so badly that this is the only place that you can exert any kind of influence and maybe some kind of an authority in a marketplace that you've messed up. So the Minister of Employment and Labour is now going to audit every single business in South Africa that has received Ters. The reality is that you have to prepare for an audit. It will either be conducted by the Department of Employment and Labour, or it will be conducted by SARS, or in fact, the Minister has threatened forensic auditing, which they don't have the capacity to do it internally, so they'll outsource it. What I want to discuss with you now today is this notion of what it is to be audited, because it's nothing scary. And as long as you have your house in order and you've prepared for an audit, then you should be confident that whatever you've done within the rules. And if inadvertently the rules have been broken because they've been so badly specified by the Ministry of Labour and they've changed and moved the goalposts with every publication of a new gazette dealing with Ters, as long as you are able to identify where there are problems, point those problems out to the Unemployment Insurance Fund and rectify the problems. So if you receive payments for the wrong things, pay it back. If you've not got the right kind of documentation in place, remediate and correct it so that you do have the right kind of documentation in place. Prepare yourself for an audit so that when you eventually get audited, you've got nothing to hide and you can be forceful, you can be articulate, and you can be assertive. There's no auditor in the world who has the right to dominate or to bully you, and you have every right in the world to fight back. And that's really what this Zoom is about. It's about the great fight back that you should be launching, not only against the Department of Education and Labour, but importantly against the philosophy that this minister has of driving a wedge between employers on the one hand and employees on the other hand, always bearing in mind that this minister is an ex-trade unionist, member of the South African Communist Party, and a sworn enemy of the business community. We have a Ministry of Labour, which is a proletariat which fights against business. And to the extent that it pits labor against business, this Ministry of Employment and Labour is the enemy of the business community. And you have to prepare to go to war, knowing that you're going to be audited under the signature of the general that is lining his cannons up against you, the business community, because he wants to be able to say to labor, trade union members, this is what business is doing to victimize you. That's the narrative that this minister has, from the very beginning, been spewing out there with no fact and no precision whatsoever. So let's get to the presentation. So as I've said, my name is Ivor Blumenthal. I'm Chief Executive Officer of ARC Consult, and we are talking here about the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the notion of the Temporary Employee Relief Fund, TERS. The fund was created to compensate a company which is in distress as a result of the lockdown, which has ongoing obligations to employees who are not, and this is critically important, those employees are not on sick leave and they're not on normal leave. So TERS doesn't apply to the normal work situation. if work is going on, even if it's going on from home, it disqualifies the employer from having access to Ters. You need to know that, you need to understand that. If one looks at the Gazette on the 8th of April, where they define temporary layoff, Ters gets activated when the company engages in temporarily laying its staff off because there is a temporary closure of the business operation, whether total or partial, due to COVID, for the period of the national disaster. So Ters doesn't get activated unless there's a temporary layoff. Temporary layoff is essentially a no-fault dismissal for a temporary period of time. So the employee has no more relationship of employment with the employer, and therefore Ters is activated. Should an employer, as a result of COVID, close its operation or a part of its operation for a 3-month period or lesser, the affected employee shall qualify for a COVID-19 benefit. Now, we know that after that 3-month period, Ters was again extended by the ministry or by the president, really. When it comes to a salary, or rather when it comes to the amount of Ters, Ters has been capped at 17,712 Rand per month per employee. So from 0 Rand all the way through to 17,712 Rand, Ters will be paid, but not beyond 17,712 Rand. And I'll demonstrate and illustrate this in a little while. It's paid on a sliding scale from 38% at those earning the least amount all the way through to, from 60% for those earning the least amount all the way up to 38% for those earning the most. Should an employee's income determine in terms of the income replacement sliding scale fall below 3,500 Rand, the employee will be paid a replacement income equal to that amount. So if you're paying less than 3,500 Rand, which is the minimum wage, Ters will pay 3,500 Rand to that individual. It's critically important that you do know and understand that. So the temporary employee relief that Ters is as a result of the temporary layoff of the employee. It's that, and I'm repeat it again, it's that temporary layoff that activates Ters. Ters is not short-time unemployment insurance, sick leave unemployment insurance, or general unemployment insurance. The unemployment insurance fund is an umbrella of multiple funds, one of which is Ters, but there are others such as short-time sick leave, unemployment, etc. An employee is entitled to claim under short-time sick leave or unemployment if the employee claims, whereas Ters is the only scheme where the employer claims on behalf of the employees because the Department of Labor have said it's safer that way. Instead of having millions of employees rushing in for Ters, the employer can claim on behalf of multiple employees. And that's the justification that Ters is unlike the other unemployment insurance fund components, because Ters is the only fund where the employer can claim on behalf of the employees. Now, Ters doesn't relieve the employer of having to honor its contract of employment unless there is a layoff. Because with a layoff, you do not have to pay more than Ters to the individual. Ters compensates part of the employer's salary, payroll expenses, after the fact, after those expenses have been incurred. It is therefore a rebate and may not result in a prepayment. In paying the employee's monthly salary, employers must recognize that the Ters rebate will set off part of the salary expense. And unless paid at the minimum wage of 3,500 Rand, never the total amount. So this notion, and again, it's a narrative created by the Minister of Employment and Labor because he is pandering to employees and trade unions. But this idea that government have substituted government recognized the effect that the disaster is having on people's lives, and so therefore it substituted what the employer can't pay with what the government magnanimously, through the Unemployment Insurance Fund, is agreeing to pay. But in reality, what government is not saying to employees disingenuously is that Ters will never compensate for the total wage or the total salary unless the person is earning less than 3,500 Rand a month. And government is silent in that regard because it wants to create the expectation that the employee is entitled to a full salary or a full wage, and that the employer somehow has to supplement Ters to make that happen. There is nothing in law that says that that's a requirement. And in fact, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act say to the contrary. To the contrary. No work, no pay. An employer needs his head read if he decides to supplement Ters to the extent that he makes up the employee's salary, because he sets the precedent. It's an expectation set by government, but not in regulation or law. And the next time something like this comes around, it's an expectation the employee is going to have, even though it's not written in law. Generally, let's take someone making 20,000 Rand. So not at the lower levels, but someone making 20,000 Rand. First of all, we know that the Ters, the maximum of that 20,000 Rand that Ters will pay out is 6,800 Rand. The question is whether it's taxable or not. Now, again, this is an art, not a science. The majority of economists, the majority of lawyers who deal with this kind of thing say, well, because it's something that belongs to the employee, that the employer is only collecting from the UIF, but on behalf of the employee, you don't put it through payroll, and therefore it's not taxable. And they're most probably right, except this is something that only the Department of Employment and Labor has commented on, not the South African Receiver of Revenue, not SARS. So my recommendation to you is that if you want to avoid a SARS audit, a PAYE audit, for example, if you want to avoid in a PAYE audit from SARS saying to you, well, why didn't you tax Ters? Get a directive from SARS. Don't believe the Minister of Employment and Labor, because he is going to lie to you if you're business, and he's going to set you up. And really, if someone, even your payroll company, even your payroll platform, your IT platform, says to you it's not taxable, get it in writing from SARS. At least ask SARS to comment, to give you a tax directive in that regard that it's not taxable. It's their job to give you a tax directive. Ask them for a tax directive. Don't take it for granted because one of the lawyers or one of the economists says it's not taxable, or anyone from the Department of Labor says it's not taxable. Do not take that for granted. Get it from the horse's mouth. But this is how it would work. So if it was only Ters, then the person wouldn't get 20,000 Rand, he'd only get 6,800 Rand. If you apply the principle of no work, no pay, then all he would get is 6,800 Rand, and he would forfeit 13,200 Rand. With leave pay, in other words, you give him the opportunity to encash his leave pay, where you specifically say to him, you do not have to encash your leave pay, but then it's no work, no pay. But if he elects to encash his leave pay, and let's say his leave pay is 7,200 Rand, that means that he will get 14,000 Rand. And the question then is the leave pay taxable? So not the Ters, if you get a directive from SARS, but is the leave pay at least taxable in that person's hands? And there's no question. The jury is not out on whether the leave pay is taxable. It is only, is the Ters pay taxable or not taxable? So there's a way of calculating. I've asked the question, is Ters taxable? Only SARS can give you a definitive answer. There are, however, converging expert opinions. And I've quoted here Bradley Workman Davis of Worksmans, and I've quoted Graham Palmer, who's a director of the Commercial Department of Garlick and Bousfield. But both of them basically say the same thing, that the amount is not taxable or subject to PAYE, as the amount paid by Ters is a statutory benefit payable by the UIF and not remuneration payable by the employer. However, encashment of leave pay is remuneration payable by the employer. So if there are three components to what you pay a person to try and get them as close to their wage or salary, where you pay them in lieu of TERS, where you and then set TERS off, you don't put that part through payroll. If you get a SARS tax directive, where you allow the employee to encash their leave, that is very definitely taxable. And then if you're going to top it up, that would be taxable as well. So those are the three maximums. But when you get a chance, read these two opinions, the one from Bradley Workman Davis, the other one from Graham Palmer, just to give you a little bit of peace of mind if you have decided not to go to SARS for a tax directive, but at the same time not to tax TERS, as I believe the majority of you would. The Department of Employment and Labor Audit, what do they want to see? Well, they want to see that the employee has been paid the TERS amount, either in advance or retroactively, that they've been paid the TERS amount, either in advance or retroactively. So I want to read you two extracts, one from the 8th of April and the other one from the 4th of May. And on the 8th of April, they say, subject to the amount of the benefit contemplated, an employee may only receive COVID-19 benefits in terms of the directive if the total of the benefit together with any additional payment by the employer in any period is not more than the remuneration that the employee would ordinarily have received for working during that period. So that 5.3 on the 8th of April tells you that the expectation, the narrative that's been put out there by the Minister of Employment and Labor, that somehow over and above what the employer pays you, if the UIF pays a company TERS on behalf of an individual, the company must pay TERS to that individual, is not true if it takes that individual beyond their normal average salary. The company is entitled to set the TERS received off against what it's prepaid that employee. On the 4th of May, roughly a month later, the Department of Employment and Labor say this: an employer who has required an employee to take annual leave during the period of lockdown, in terms of the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, may set off any amount received from the UIF in respect of that employee's COVID-19 benefit against the amount paid to the employee in respect of annual leave, provided that the employee is credited with the proportionate entitlement to paid annual leave in the future. So basically, what they're saying here is that if you've paid the individual and then you get the money back, the first thing that must be done is you set off against annual leave which has been deducted and pay that annual leave back to the individual, and that then supplements everything else you've paid. Once that's been done, you set it off against the TERS. 5.5 says, to speed payment of COVID-19 benefits to employees, employers are urged to pay employees based on the directive and reimburse or set off such with COVID-19 benefits claim payments from UIF. That says to you that an employer is able to prepay the person the TERS, and then when the employer gets the TERS back, to set it off against the amount that's been prepaid. Unfortunately, again, the same guy who came out and signed this directive came out and said, irrespective of what you get paid, when TERS is paid out, it must be paid over to the employee, giving rise to the expectation over and above what you've been paid, even if, and again, giving rise to the expectation, even if it takes you way beyond what your average salary that's paid to you should be. So that's the first, that the employee has been paid the TERS amount either in advance or retroactively. That's the first thing you've got to prove to the auditors. The second thing you've got to prove is that the total salary paid does not exceed the normal salary paid. And I've read the regulation to you. The third is that the employee has been given an express option of not having to cash in their leave and face a no work, no pay situation. Express option means in writing you've said to your employees, or retroactively you get them to sign that they understood it this way if it wasn't done at the time. I say that again, it has to be expressed. So even if it wasn't done at the time, retroactively after the fact, you can get them to sign to acknowledge that they knew that they could cash in their leave and therefore get close to what their monthly payment might be, or that they didn't have to cash in their leave, in which case it would be a no work, no pay situation. You need to prove that you've had that discussion or engagement with your employees, and it should be reduced to writing. And finally, that the employee did not work during the period claimed for. Do not make the mistake of claiming terms, and if you have, pay it back. Do not make the mistake of claiming terms, and if you have, pay it back. If there is any doubt that the employee was actually at work, but you claim TERS, or that the employee was working from home and you claim TERS. That is what will make this a criminal claim. TERS cannot be claimed if there is any chance that the employee was working either at the workplace or at home, but doing work for which he had to be remunerated. Remember, TERS is the only situation where the employer will claim for the employee. Only if the employer does not claim can the employee claim for themselves. And here's another extract from the 15th of May, which is after the last one I read you. You can see how many times the department clarified, changed, moved the goalposts, etc. But this is important. An employee may individually apply for COVID-19 benefits if no bargaining council or entity has got involved in claiming on behalf of its member companies, or, and this is the kicker, the employee's employer has failed or refused to apply for COVID-19 benefits. So only if the employer has said, I'm not applying, you can apply, is the employee entitled to apply. If the employer applies for COVID-19 benefits, the employee cannot also apply for COVID-19 benefits because that's a double claim. Very, very important. Now, this directive was on the 15th of May made retroactive to the beginning of lockdown, 27th of March. What must you be able to show the auditor? What do they want to see? Well, they want to see that you can reconcile the UIF TERS payment against the employee details claimed for. So that you can reconcile the payment against the employee details claimed for. So that that employee works for you. It's that person on whose behalf you've paid UIF to. There must be proof that during the lockdown or temporary layoff that the employee was paid the TERS amount paid to the employer. So if UIF is paid over to the employer, the next month, the employer is obligated to show that the employee was paid the same amount of money, either upfront or only when TERS was received. It's fine, it doesn't matter when it was paid. Calculations in setting the TERS amount paid to the employer off against amounts paid to the employee. So the auditor will want to see how you calculated those set-offs. Just prepare a schedule of set-offs. 1,000 Rand received, 1,000 Rand paid to the employee on the following date. It can be a date before the money was received, it doesn't matter. And evidence that the employee was given the option of not having to cash in on their leave and therefore facing a no work, no pay situation. Evidence of that. In writing, even if it's retroactively, I, the employee, acknowledge that during the time of lockdown, I was given the option of encashing my leave so that I got more money than just TERS in for that month. But I was also told I didn't have to encash my leave. I didn't have to take leave. But in that instance, it would be a no work, no pay situation. Again, let me just say that comes from the Basic Conditions of Employment Act that says no work, no pay. What must you be able to show the auditor? What do they want to see over and above that? Letters, emails, phone calls to the UIF, even if unanswered. So if you've done something, you want to legitimate it by showing that you sent an email to the UIF or you tried to phone the UIF, but your calls went unanswered. just want to see evidence that you've exhausted your obligation to communicate with the UIF. The fact that they've not answered you is not the important thing. And importantly, you've got to remember that in our law, if you ask a question, can I do this? And the UIF is silent, then after a period of time, and it's for you to define the period of time, it could be 2 weeks, it could be a month. But if they haven't come back to you in a month, then you can take it that that is acknowledgement that you can do whatever you were asking to do. And it will be for the UIF to answer as to why they didn't respond to you. What you must not be is bullied into a number of things. The Department of Employment and Labor and SARS will try to bully you into admitting that you've acted fraudulently and corruptly, because this is the Department of Employment and Labor's narrative, that we as government have given out of the goodness of our heart Ters. The reality is they haven't. The employers actually paid UIF. The government's got nothing to do with it. But out of the goodness of our heart, we've given Ters, and the employers have abused it. And so they will use these audits to try and bully you into acknowledging that. As long as you can satisfy everything we've spoken about, all of these things, what they want to see, and that you've done all of these things that I spoke about a little earlier, there is absolutely no need for you to acknowledge guilt in any respect whatsoever and be bullied into making concessions that no sound of mind person would ever be making. The only time you make a concession is if you've not paid your employee at least what you've received from the UIF as Ters. So you've claimed Ters, but you didn't prepay it and you didn't pay it, or you didn't pay it when you received Ters. Then you've made a mistake. Unless you've claimed Ters, even though you were open for business and trading, you have to correct it, because that's the cardinal mistake you shouldn't be making. Unless the employee worked from home but was paid for doing so, even though Ters was also claimed. Ters cannot be claimed if there is any work going on by that individual employee. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. And if it was, you've got to acknowledge, you've got to admit your mistake, you've got to put it down to the minister's haphazard shotgunning and spurting of regulations left, right, and center so that you never know where you stand. And you've got to make an offer to repay that money. And finally, you never gave the employee the option of not cashing their leave in, where you insisted they had to cash their leave in. These are the cardinal sins that you will be hunted down for by the auditors. So rather, if you know it's happened, admit it up front, and before the auditors get there, say to the UIF, please give us the banking details because we want to pay the money back. If you believe that you've benefited unjustly, in other words, if you believe that any of these things here are true, that you've not paid your employee even though you've got Ters, that you claim Ters even though you were open for business, that the employee worked from home and was paid for working from home, but you still claim Ters for them, or that you never gave the employee the option of not cashing leave in, then write to the UIF, acknowledge the mistake, blame it on the Minister of Employment and Labor, ask for banking details to repay the money, and repay the monies before the auditors get onto your doorstep. Because one thing you must acknowledge and understand and realize is that if you're found to, in fact, have done any of these things and you haven't admitted it and you haven't tried to make recompense, you face not only a hefty fine, but you face a criminal sanction. In other words, that it'll be on your record and your company's record, and that's not what you want. All right, so we ran the session earlier and there were lots of questions and answers, but what I've done here is I've tried to actually answer those questions and answers, the most pressing being the issue of tax. What I do want to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is that I am conducting a podcast interview on Friday with a tax expert from Weber Wenzels, and I will post that onto the WhatsApp groups as soon as I've completed that. But again, I say, irrespective of what any of these people say about whether or not Ters is taxable, the leave pay is taxable. And importantly, get it from the horse's mouth. Ask SARS for a tax directive as to whether or not Ters should be taxed. Let them come back to you and say, no, not necessary to tax it because it is simply a payment from the UIF to the employee. The only role the employer is paying is claiming and acting as a post office for the payment or acting as a bank for the payment. Thank you very much for joining me here on this discussion. I hope it's been of value to you. And I want to urge you, please, and in fact, what I will do is I'm going to, in the chat here, just quickly type out my number. It's 082-880-5316, 082-880-5316. My email address is ivorb@arcconsult.com. If you've got any questions, please email me. I'll try to answer them. If you manage to get a tax directive from SARS, please send it to me so that I can then send it on to all the other business people out there. Because once SARS has commented, they've commented. I've not seen a tax directive from SARS to this effect, though. But some of my clients have, in fact, asked SARS. They've not yet received it, but they've asked SARS for that tax directive. If you have the tax directive, please kindly do me the honor of sending it to me at ivorb@arcconsult.com or posting it on my WhatsApp number, 082-880-5316, so that I can distribute it widely so that we can help each other, so that we can create a community of interest amongst ourselves, so that the Minister of Employment and Labor doesn't get his way, which is to demonize employers and to drive a massive wedge between employers and the people who work in their businesses, which can never be repaired and never be fixed. This minister is a short-term minister. He doesn't care about the damage he's causing, but I think it'll be huge damage to employers, but in the process, equally to employees. Thank you so much for joining me. And again, I hope you found value in this session.